Imagine looking up at a sky you thought you understood, a sky you believed belonged to you, shaped by your rules, defined by your aircraft, and guarded by pilots who trusted every lesson they had ever learned. Now imagine the moment that sky suddenly felt wrong, not because of a storm or an omen, but because of a shape cutting through the clouds that didn't match anything in your textbooks, anything in your training, anything in your imagination. That shape was light, impossibly light. It moved as if the air welcomed it, almost embraced it. It twisted, turned, and climbed with a kind of ease that didn't seem mechanical at all. It felt alive. That shape was Japan's Mitsubishi AM60, and the moment it appeared, the Pacific War changed forever. At first, American pilots didn't understand what they were seeing. They thought it had to be some modified European aircraft, or maybe just a really skilled enemy pilot pushing an ordinary machine beyond its limits. But the truth settled in quickly and violently. The Zero wasn't ordinary, and the pilots flying it weren't improvising. This was something entirely new, something the United States had never prepared for. Before the Zero arrived, the Pacific felt predictable. American fighters like the Wildcat and P-40 were tough, sturdy, familiar. They had armor where a pilot expected armor, fuel tanks where a pilot expected fuel tanks, and controls that behaved the way physics textbooks said they should. The Zero ignored all of that. To understand the Zero, you have to understand what Japan was trying to accomplish long before the war began. Japan didn't have the engine power or industrial output America had. So instead of building a fighter around horsepower, they built one around philosophy. Their engineers believed a perfect fighter was not the one that could take a hit, but the one that could avoid every hit entirely. If you never got hit, you never needed armor. If you never got hit, you never needed self-sealing fuel tanks. If you could turn faster than anyone else, then you controlled the fight, and the opponent never had a chance to fire back. The Zero was born from that extreme belief. Everything unnecessary was carved away. Metal was shaved thin enough to flex. Protection around the pilot was removed. Weight was treated like the enemy. Every gram mattered. Every surface mattered. Every curve of the wing was designed to keep the aircraft light, responsive, and obedient at the slow speeds where dogfights were won. And the result was breathtaking. American pilots faced it for the first time in late 1941 and early 1942, and their reactions bordered on disbelief. They described the Zero as something that shouldn't exist. It could turn inside any Allied fighter. It could climb as if gravity had loosened its grip. It could stay airborne for distances that felt impossible for a single-engine aircraft. And in a close-range dogfight, it was untouchable. Allied fighters dropped from the sky in every theater where the Zero appeared, in the Philippines, in Malaya, over the jungles of Burma, across the waters of the Dutch East Indies, even along the northern edge of Australia. Everywhere it went, the pattern was the same. Every Allied pilot who tried to fight the Zero the way they had been trained paid for it with their life. Every squadron that relied on old tactics was erased with terrifying speed. What made this even more demoralizing was that the first American intelligence reports describing the Zero had been ignored. Pilots in China had already warned the United States that Japan was fielding a fighter unlike anything seen before. But those reports were dismissed as exaggerations. No one believed Japan had the capability to build such an advanced aircraft. No one believed a nation with limited industrial reach could produce a machine that outperformed Western designs in almost every category that mattered in a dogfight. But when the Zero arrived, the sky itself proved those assumptions wrong. American pilots started noticing something unsettling. They weren't just losing because the Zero was strong. They were losing because they didn't understand what they were up against. They tried to outturn it. They tried to fight it nose to nose. They tried to dogfight with it as if it were another Wildcat or P-40. Every one of those attempts ended the same way. The Zero danced around them, slipped behind them, closed in for the kill with frightening precision. In the time it took an American pilot to realize the fight was lost, the Zero was already in position to fire. In those early months, Allied pilots wrote terrible things in their journals. They called the Zero a ghost, a nightmare, a monster with wings. Some described it as an aircraft that seemed to read your thoughts before you acted. Others said it felt like fighting something with no weaknesses at all. For 6 months, that impression felt true. The Zero ruled the sky, and the Allies had no answer. But war has a way of forcing innovation, and fear has a way of turning into analysis when enough people survive to talk about what they saw. Slowly, painfully, patterns began to emerge. Certain climb angles the Zero preferred, certain speeds where its elegance began to crack, moments where it hesitated just slightly when forced into a vertical maneuver, spots in a dogfight where American aircraft, heavy as they were, could sometimes slip out of the Zero's reach. A handful of American pilots began turning fear into strategy, and among them was one man who refused to accept the idea of a perfect enemy. His name was John Thach, and he was about to become the first American who truly understood that the Zero wasn't unbeatable. It was simply waiting for the right opponent to figure it out. John Thach was not the kind of pilot who relied on instinct alone. He didn't believe in legends, myths, or the idea of an unbeatable opponent. When other pilots said the Zero could turn inside any aircraft, he didn't hear fear. He heard data, patterns, clues. While most American pilots were still trying to process how overwhelming the Zero seemed, Thach was sitting at his kitchen table with 2 small wooden model airplanes, sliding them across the surface, trying to understand what made the Zero strong and what might make it weak. He studied every scrap of information coming out of China, even the reports everyone else dismissed. He read accounts of impossible turns, sudden climbs, and a lightness that made Western fighters feel clumsy by comparison. But Thach also paid attention to the details hidden between the lines. Even the most enthusiastic descriptions of the Zero hinted at something else, something subtle, something exploitable. If the Zero was light, then maybe it lost stability at high speeds. If it could twist and turn with ease, then maybe it struggled with heavier, more forceful maneuvers. If it climbed like a feather, then maybe it dove like one too. Thach wasn't sure yet, but he believed one thing with absolute certainty. A machine designed with extreme priorities must have extreme weaknesses. Nothing in aviation came for free. While other pilots focused on trying to beat the Zero alone, Thach asked a different question. What if victory didn't come from a single aircraft, but from 2? What if teamwork, not raw performance, was the Zero's true enemy? He imagined 2 American fighters flying side by side. He imagined a Zero diving on one of them. He imagined what would happen if the 2 American pilots coordinated their turns, crossing paths at just the right moment. If the Zero chased one, the other would have a clean shot. If the Zero switched targets, the original pilot would regain the advantage. It was a dance, a trap, a pattern that punished the Zero's single-minded style of dogfighting. He tested it again and again with his wooden models. Each time, the result was the same. The Zero chased one American plane straight into the line of fire of the other. Thach called his new idea a weave, a pattern of crossing paths, shifting angles, exchanged positions. Simple, elegant, deadly. When he finally presented it to other pilots, some were skeptical. They thought it looked reckless, dangerous, a maneuver designed by someone desperate rather than someone brilliant. But Thach knew the truth. The Zero was designed for perfection in a one-on-one duel, a duel the Japanese expected every time, a duel that had defined the early war. The Weave was built to break that expectation. Not long after, the Zero and Thach met for the first time in the sky above the Pacific. And that day, everything changed. On a warm June morning near Midway, Thach and his squadron spotted a group of Japanese fighters approaching. The sun glinted off their wings. Their silhouettes looked as effortless and deadly as the rumors had described. As the Zeros closed in, Thach heard the tension in his pilots' voices. This was the moment every American airman dreaded, the moment when the Zero began its familiar dance, the moment when instinct screamed to dogfight or flee. But Thach didn't run. He didn't turn hard. He didn't climb or dive. He simply said into the radio, in a calm voice that betrayed no fear, "Execute the weave." Two wildcats angled away from each other, then turned inward at the exact same moment. The Zeros dove after them, expecting an easy kill. But instead of panic, they found geometry. The Americans crossed paths again. The Zeros corrected their angles, confident they would slot in behind one of the wildcats. They didn't realize they had flown directly into a trap. As one of the Zeros made its final turn, Thach rolled his wildcat into position and opened fire. The bullets hit the Japanese fighter squarely. The Zero trailed smoke, then flame, then dropped toward the ocean. Thach had just proven what few believed possible. The Zero could be beaten. Not by matching its strengths, but by attacking its weaknesses. Not by fighting like it fought, but by forcing it into the kind of battle it wasn't designed to win. For the first time in the war, American pilots returned home not feeling hunted, but feeling hopeful. Pilots who once described the Zero as a phantom now spoke about it like a machine, dangerous, but not unstoppable. Rumors spread across squadrons. Diagrams of the Weave were copied again and again. Commanders ordered every pilot to memorize the maneuver. But the Weave was only the beginning. A tactical breakthrough? Yes. A psychological victory? Absolutely. But something even bigger was coming. Something no one on either side could have predicted. A crash. A single pilot. An accident on a remote island that would reveal every secret the Zero had kept hidden. Every angle. Every weakness. Every compromise that made it both beautiful and breakable. The Zero was about to be exposed, and it would happen in the most unlikely way imaginable.
The Zero's reign might have lasted far longer if not for an accident that no one planned, no one expected, and no one on the Japanese side ever imagined would become one of the most decisive turning points of the air war. It happened on a remote stretch of the Aleutian Islands, a place where cold wind and fog swallowed entire landscapes, a place far removed from the tropical battles that defined the Pacific. Here, in the isolation of Akutan Island, a single Zero fell from the sky and survived. The pilot, Tadayoshi Koga, was young, skilled, and proud, the kind of aviator Japan's training system produced at its peak. On that day, he wasn't supposed to become a historical figure. He wasn't supposed to become the man who handed America the keys to understanding the Zero. He was simply flying a mission, trusting the agility beneath him, the responsiveness in the controls, and the aircraft that had made him feel untouchable. But fate does not negotiate. During the mission, Koga Zero took damage from ground fire, not enough to drop it immediately, but enough to force him to attempt a risky landing. He spotted what looked like a smooth, flat field and brought the Zero down with as much control as he could manage. What he didn't know, what no one could have known from the air, was that the apparently flat field was actually a marsh. The Zero's landing gear dug into the soft ground. The aircraft flipped forward with violent force. Koga's neck snapped instantly. The Zero lay upside down, battered but largely intact, its wings crumpled but its structure preserved. The engine remained untouched. The controls were there. The frame was there. The heart of the aircraft, the part the Americans most needed, was sitting on a lonely island with no Japanese rescue team able to reach it. Several weeks later, a U.S. Navy PBY patrol plane spotted something strange on the tundra below. The crew circled. They saw the rising sun insignia on the wings. They saw the shape of the airframe. They radioed the discovery in with disbelief. The Americans had found a Zero, a real, flyable Zero. The aircraft that had dominated the Pacific was about to be studied, repaired, and flown by the very nation it had terrorized. A recovery team arrived quickly. When they approached the wreck, they found the cockpit sealed with mud. Inside was Koga's body, still strapped in. They buried him respectfully nearby, not realizing they were burying the man who had unknowingly changed the course of the war. The Zero was hauled out of the marsh, loaded onto a ship and transported to North Island Naval Air Station in San Diego. There, for the first time in the war, American engineers and test pilots walked around Japan's greatest fighter with their hands on their hips and smiles of disbelief spreading across their faces. The mystique evaporated almost instantly. Up close, the Zero looked flimsy. The metal skin felt thin enough to dent with your knuckles. The wiring looked delicate, almost fragile. The cockpit was cramped, with almost no protection for the pilot. There was no armor plate, no bulletproof glass, no self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft's elegance suddenly appeared dangerous, not to its enemy, but to the men flying it. When American test pilots took the restored Zero into the air, they finally saw the truth. Yes, the Zero could turn like nothing else. Yes, it responded instantly at low speeds. Yes, its agility at medium speeds was astonishing. But the weaknesses were all there, exposed like fractures in glass. At high speeds, the controls stiffened badly. The light frame shuddered during hard dives. The roll rate collapsed once the aircraft pushed past certain limits. And in the vertical plan, the Zero lost energy faster than the Americans had ever realized. The strengths were real, but the weaknesses were catastrophic. A Zero in a slow-speed dogfight was a master. A Zero in a high-speed fight was prey. A Zero flown below 250 miles per hour was deadly. A Zero forced above 300 miles per hour was predictable. A Zero allowed to dictate the engagement was a nightmare. A Zero dragged into American tactics was breakable. The test pilots walked away stunned, not by how strong the Zero was, but by how shockingly vulnerable it became when pushed the right way. One pilot summed it up perfectly after his first test flight. He stepped out of the cockpit, pulled off his helmet, and said with a grin, "It's a magnificent airplane until you stop playing by its rules." Those rules were the only thing keeping the Zero alive. The Americans now understood the truth Japan had tried so hard to hide. The Zero was a blade, razor sharp at the tip, but thin and brittle along the edge. Push it just a little too far, and the entire structure began to give way. American tacticians took this new knowledge and built a doctrine around it. They taught pilots to avoid turning fights entirely. They taught them to dive, to boom and zoom, to use altitude and speed as weapons. They taught them to fight vertically, not horizontally. They taught them to strike fast, climb away, and strike again. They taught them to deny the Zero the one thing it relied on above all else: control. And most importantly, they taught pilots to stay fast. Speed was life. Speed was survival. Speed was the Zero's worst enemy. By the time these new tactics reached frontline squadrons, the fear that once strangled American pilots had transformed into something else. Confidence, clarity, a sense that the Zero was no longer a monster in the sky, but just another machine with strength and weaknesses like any other. But that wasn't enough. The United States now understood the Zero, but to defeat it completely, America would need something more powerful than tactics. It would need a new generation of fighters, machines built not from desperation, but from overwhelming industrial strength. Machines designed from the ground up to kill the Zero in every dimension of flight. Those machines were coming. Japan didn't know it yet, but the days of the Zero ruling the sky were numbered, and the countdown had already begun.
The Zero still ruled the early Pacific skies in 1942, but the tides beneath that dominance were already shifting. American pilots were flying differently. They were fighting differently. They were learning faster than anyone in Japan imagined possible. And with every engagement, with every report filed after combat, another piece of the Zero's aura chipped away. But tactics alone could not win the war. Not when Japan still held the initiative. Not when the Zero still dictated the first move. And not when American aircraft, despite improved strategies, were still fundamentally outperformed in certain flight regimes. The United States needed something else. It needed fighters built to outmuscle the Zero. It needed aircraft with better engines,
stronger frames, higher dive speeds, and the kind of protection that allowed a pilot to survive even a mistake. It needed machines that didn't have to respect the Zero's rules. And as the Zero continued cutting across the Pacific with elegance and lethality, American factories were roaring awake behind the scenes. Engineers were sketching designs, assembly lines were forming, prototypes were being pushed to their limits. The next era of American air power was rising, and when it arrived, the Zero would face an opponent it had never been built to withstand, a nation capable of building perfection in mass. But before those machines could reshape the air war, the Zero still had one more moment of supremacy, a moment when Japanese pilots believed the sky still belonged to them, a moment that felt like destiny, victory, inevitability. That moment unfolded over the Solomon Islands in a long, brutal series of battles that stretched across jungle, sea, and sky. Here, the Zero wasn't just a weapon. It was a lifeline, a guardian, a spear thrown again and again against the expanding reach of American power. Guadalcanal became the place where all illusions would eventually die. But in the beginning, Japan believed it could repeat the triumphs of 1941 and early 1942. The Zero had never failed them. The Zero had never been outflown at slow speeds. The Zero had never encountered an opponent who truly understood how to counter it. So when American forces landed on that long, humid strip of island, Japan assumed the story was already written. The invaders would be pushed back. The airfield they captured would be bombed into ashes, and the Zero, once again, would cleanse the sky. But the Americans on Guadalcanal were not the same pilots Japan had crushed in the early war. They had learned. They had adapted. They had changed because they had no choice. Every man on that island knew the Zero's reputation. They knew its turning radius. They knew its favorite angles of attack. They knew its climb. They knew its low-speed magic. Most importantly, they knew its limits. In the early days over Guadalcanal, the Zero still felt terrifying. Its arrival was unmistakable, its presence almost graceful. It carved through the air with the same deadly precision it always had. But this time, the fights didn't unfold in the old, predictable pattern. American pilots didn't try to outturn it. They didn't let it decide the angle of engagement. They didn't allow the fight to slow down. They dived. They climbed. They refused to give the Zero what it wanted. And when forced into close combat, they executed new tactics with a kind of discipline Japan didn't expect. Slowly, the Zero's kill ratio began to change. Not dramatically at first, not enough to panic Japanese commanders, but enough that some pilots noticed the difference, enough that certain engagements ended with the Zero being forced away instead of dominating. Japan ignored these signs. Success had made them confident. Victory had made them rigid. The Zero had become more than a machine. It had become a symbol, a guarantee, a promise that Japanese pilots could enter any fight and come out unscathed. Symbols are dangerous things in war. They can blind you to what's changing right in front of your eyes. And Guadalcanal was changing everything. The long siege, the endless night battles, the brutal supply runs, the constant American pressure, all of it strained the Zero's world in ways Japan had not prepared for. The aircraft was still formidable, but the pilots flying it were no longer the elites who had trained for years before the war. Japan's pre-war aviators were irreplaceable. Their training had taken so long and consumed so many resources that wartime replacements could never match their skill. Every Zero lost over Guadalcanal damaged Japan twice. The machine was hard to replace. The pilot was nearly impossible. Japan's reserve of top-tier aviators began to thin. The Zero was still agile, still deadly, still iconic, but increasingly flown by men with fewer hours in the sky, fewer mentors to guide them, fewer chances to survive long enough to learn. Meanwhile, American pilots returning from the island brought back something priceless: experience, real combat lessons, real fights against Japan's best. Every report turned into another tactical refinement. Every survivor became a teacher. Every engagement helped reshape American doctrine. And somewhere deep in the American industrial heartland, factories were rolling out the next chapter of the air war. Fighters with engines that dwarfed anything Japan could produce. Fighters with armor thick enough to shrug off hits that would have killed any Zero. Fighters that had the speed to control every engagement. Fighters that didn't just counter Japanese philosophy, they erased it. The Zero had dominated a world built on maneuverability. The new American fighters were built for a world defined by speed, mass production, and raw power. The age of the Zero was ending, and a new age was rising, roaring to life on an assembly line thousands of miles away. The Zero didn't know it yet. Japan didn't know it yet. But the skies above the Pacific were about to be rewritten by machines the Zero was never designed to face.
The Zero's world began to unravel the moment America introduced fighters that were no longer trying to outturn it, outmaneuver it, or outdance it. These new machines weren't built to match the Zero's style. They were built to crush it. The first real sign of this shift appeared with an aircraft that seemed almost too big, too heavy, too muscular to belong in the same sky as the Zero. American pilots joked that it looked more like a flying brick than a fighter. It didn't glide like the Zero. It didn't whisper through the air. It thundered. That aircraft was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not delicate. It was not elegant. It did not move with the Zero's effortless grace. But it didn't need to. It had something far more important. A massive engine, thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, heavy firepower, and a dive speed that could rip straight past anything the Zero could safely handle. The Hellcat did not fear the Zero's turn. It did not enter the fight at the Zero's preferred speed. It did not play the Zero's game. Instead, it chose every fight on its own terms. When a Hellcat spotted a Zero below, it would dive with such force that the Japanese pilot couldn't follow. If a Zero tried to climb, the Hellcat simply powered above it. And if a Zero tried to outturn it, the Hellcat pilot didn't even bother engaging. He just kept the fight fast and vertical. The Zero had been designed for an era when dogfights were artistic duels. The Hellcat was born for an era where air combat was a science. The difference was devastating. By the time Hellcat squadrons began entering combat in late 1943, American pilots realized something extraordinary. They weren't just matching the Zero. They were outperforming it, outclimbing it, outdiving it, outshooting it, outlasting it. The Zero still turned tighter, but everything else belonged to the Hellcat. In the months that followed, the kill ratios were staggering. American pilots flying Hellcats returned with reports that seemed impossible in the early days of the war. They believed the Zero was finally an opponent they could defeat consistently and decisively. But while the Hellcat was transforming the air war, another monster was rising. A fighter even faster, tougher, and more terrifying. A machine whose silhouette alone made Zero pilots uneasy. A machine that dominated the skies from the moment it arrived. The chance-fought F-4U Corsair. If the Hellcat was a hammer, the Corsair was a lightning bolt wrapped in armor. It had incredible speed, a climb rate that dwarfed anything Japan had left, a dive that punished any Zero pilot foolish enough to follow, and an engine so powerful it made the entire aircraft tremble when the throttle opened. The Zero, which once felt light and unstoppable, suddenly looked outdated. The Corsair didn't chase the Zero. It hunted it. It attacked from above, dove through it like a storm, and climbed out before Japanese pilots could even react. The Zero's greatest strength, its agility, no longer mattered. The Americans weren't trying to turn inside it. They were simply dictating every fight with raw speed and overwhelming force. Japan tried to adapt. They tried to introduce modified versions of the Zero. They tried to train replacement pilots faster. They tried to adjust tactics. But the truth was painful and unavoidable. The Zero's era had been over the moment American industry awakened. The aircraft that once ruled the Pacific skies now struggled to survive even a few minutes in a fight against these new American monsters. It wasn't that the Zero had suddenly become a bad aircraft. It was that the world had moved on. It had stepped into a new chapter, one where speed, armor, power, and mass production mattered far more than elegance or artistry. And Japan simply could not keep up. Worse still, the Zero's original weaknesses, those that American test pilots had discovered from Koga's crash, were now brutally exploited in every engagement. Zeros tried to dive away from a Corsair, only to find the American fighter accelerating at a rate they could never match. Zeros tried to climb, only to watch Hellcats soar above them with effortless power. Zeros tried to dogfight, only to realize American pilots were refusing the duel entirely. The Zero had relied on one truth: control the fight, win the fight. Now it controlled nothing, and it won almost nothing. By 1944, the Zero was still flying, still fighting, still feared by inexperienced American pilots. But its legend was dead. Its invincibility shattered, its advantages erased, its weaknesses exposed. What remained was a machine flying on courage alone. A machine that demanded everything from the men who piloted it and offered almost nothing in return. A machine forced into battles it had never been designed to fight. But for all its growing vulnerabilities, the Zero still had one more chapter to write. A chapter not about dominance, but about survival. A chapter where its pilots fought not to win a war, but to honor a legacy. A chapter where the Zero transformed from a symbol of Japanese confidence into a symbol of Japanese desperation. And that chapter would unfold in the final, brutal year of the conflict.
By 1944, the Zero no longer lived in the world it had been built for. The sky that once felt like a stage now felt like a trap. American fighters patrolled the Pacific with engines twice as powerful, frames twice as durable, and dive speeds the Zero couldn't hope to match. Everywhere the Zero went, it was hunted. Everywhere it appeared, an American aircraft stood ready to tear it out of the sky. But Japan had no replacements. Factories were bombed, engine production had collapsed, resources were running out. What little aluminum they had was being stretched thin, shaped into the familiar silhouette of a fighter that no longer stood a chance in modern air combat. Still, Japan kept building Zeros, not because they believed it could win the war, but because it was the only fighter they could still produce in meaningful numbers. The Zero had become a symbol of necessity, not dominance. And the pilots flying it? They were no longer the elite warriors who had trained for years before the war. They were boys in their late teens, trained in a fraction of the time, forced into a cockpit designed for experts who no longer existed. Their teachers had died over the Coral Sea. Their mentors had vanished above Guadalcanal. The sky that once belonged to Japan had consumed the very men capable of teaching the next generation how to survive it. These new pilots took off with fear, disguised as duty. They looked at the instrument panel, knowing that every switch represented something their training barely touched. They held the stick, feeling the lightness that veteran pilots once called an extension of the body. But to them, that same lightness felt like fragility, a reminder that the aircraft around them was fast, but only when the fight stayed slow. Responsive, but only until the speed bled away. Deadly, but only if the enemy made mistakes Americans were no longer making. The Zero demanded precision, but Japan no longer had time to create precision pilots. In this late stage of the war, the Zero flew not as the master of the sky, but as a survivor within it. It appeared over island chains ravaged by battle, its once glorious reputation overshadowed by American radar, American firepower, and American aircraft waiting at higher altitudes. Each engagement felt more desperate than the last. Hellcats dove from above with towering speed, tearing through formations before Zero pilots could even react. Corsairs carved through the chaos with terrifying dives and climbs, leaving trails of smoke behind them as they pulled away untouched. P-38 struck from angles the Zero couldn't counter,
using raw power horse to dictate every second of the fight. And yet, the Zero kept flying. Some American pilots wrote in their journals that these late war Zeros felt different, not in performance, but in spirit. They were flown with a kind of resignation, a quiet determination, a sense of fighting for honor more than outcome. Some chases ended with the Zero refusing to abandon a hopeless attack run, its pilot clinging to the only advantage he had left: courage. In those final months, Japan turned increasingly to desperate tactics. Fuel shortages slashed training hours to nothing. Entire units were sent into combat with barely enough knowledge to keep their aircraft level. In some cases, pilots were instructed to save fuel by gliding whenever possible. A heartbreaking reminder that the machine meant to rule the air had become a tool in a collapsing system. But the most painful chapter of all came when the Zero became tied to a tactic unlike anything the world had expected. A tactic born not from strategy, but from desperation. As the American fleet drew closer to the Japanese home islands, commanders realized the truth. They no longer had the pilots, resources, or industrial strength to meet the United States head-on. The Zero, once a masterpiece of maneuverability, was now being asked to serve a role it had never been designed for. Japan began using its remaining fighters in one-way missions. Young men, barely trained, climbed into cockpits with fuel for only a single trip. Their aircraft were light, fast, and familiar, but this time the goal wasn't to engage, dogfight, or return home. The goal was impact. The Zero, built as a blade of exquisite precision, became a weapon of sacrifice. American pilots who once respected the Zero as a rival now viewed it with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. They had spent years fighting its strengths, its agility, its elegance in the air. Now they watched it dive straight at ships, a machine no longer used for mastery, but for martyrdom. But even in these final missions, the Zero showed glimmers of what it once had been. Its light frame allowed it to accelerate quickly. Its maneuverability let pilots make last-second adjustments impossible in heavier aircraft. Its range gave it reach even when fuel was rationed to the last drop. But none of that was the Zero's true purpose. None of that reflected the aircraft envisioned by the engineers who had once dreamed of creating the world's finest fighter. The Zero had become something tragic, a symbol of a nation forced into decisions no pilot should ever face. And behind that tragedy was a deeper truth. The Zero's fall was never just about technology. It was about the collapse of an entire system. A system that relied too heavily on elite pilots. A system that believed early victories would last forever. A system that underestimated the industrial might waiting across the ocean. The aircraft that had once ruled the Pacific skies now struggled simply to survive them. Yet even in defeat, the Zero remained unforgettable. American pilots spoke of its early war dominance with respect. Historians would later describe it as one of the most influential designs of its era. And every surviving Zero that limped home in the final year of the war carried with it the ghosts of the men who had once flown it with unmatched skill. The Zero was no longer the king of the sky, but it was still a symbol. A reminder of a moment when Japan touched the edge of perfection, and the long, painful fall that followed. What came next for the Zero was not combat, but something more reflective. A journey into history, memory, and the question that historians still ask today. How did a fighter so advanced, so feared, so dominant, become obsolete in less than 3 years? The answer, like the Zero itself, is far more human than mechanical.
When the war finally ended and the skies fell silent, the Zero didn't disappear. It didn't fade quietly into history. It lingered, scattered across islands, jungles, beaches, hangars, and wrecks half buried in soil. The same aircraft that once carved fear into the Pacific now lay broken in places most of the world would never see. Some were found in the jungle, vines wrapped around their wings like nature was trying to reclaim them. Some rested in the mud, their aluminum skins eaten away by salt and time. Some were discovered on remote atolls, cockpits open, seats empty, sand drifting through the fuselage where pilots once sat. They were ghosts of a vanished era, the remains of a machine that had once made the world hold its breath. And in Japan, people didn't rush to remember the Zero. They avoided it. For families who had lost sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers, the Zero didn't symbolize glory. It symbolized a coffin that never came home. It symbolized a cockpit that became a grave. It symbolized everything the war had taken from them. Engineers who had built the Zero felt the weight as well. Many of them were banned from aviation work during the occupation. Some quietly rebuilt bicycles or farm tools instead of aircraft. Others never worked in engineering again. The brilliance they poured into the Zero had become, in the eyes of post-war Japan, brilliance spent in the wrong direction. But for the pilots who survived, remembering the Zero was something even harder. When asked about their experiences, many refused to talk. Not because they were ashamed, but because every memory of a dogfight came with the face of someone who never returned. One former pilot simply said, "The Zero flew beautifully. The war did not." Years passed before the Zero began to be spoken of without fear or pain. And strangely, the first people who helped bring it back into public memory were not Japanese at all. They were Americans. The United States had preserved the Akutan Zero and several captured aircraft for testing and training. After the war, some of these machines ended up in museums or storage. Eventually, restorers and history enthusiasts began pulling them back into the light. When American pilots looked at the Zero after the war, they no longer saw an enemy. They saw a masterpiece, a machine that had forced them to adapt, innovate, think faster, and fly smarter. A machine that had pushed American aviation forward by challenging everything they thought they knew. For them, the Zero was not a villain. It was a teacher. Restoration teams treated the aircraft with reverence, carefully cleaning decades-old debris from the wings, replacing worn components, re-riveting panels that looked too thin to have survived even a single mission. Some restorers described their first time touching a Zero's skin as almost surreal. The metal felt delicate, nearly fragile, completely unlike the rugged American fighters of the same era. The idea that such a thin, light machine had once ruled the sky felt almost impossible, yet it had. Slowly, surviving Zeros were repaired, rebuilt, and brought back to life. A few even flew again. When they took off, their engines growling back to life after decades of silence, spectators said it felt like watching history breathe. People described seeing one fly as haunting, beautiful, and strangely emotional. Because when a Zero lifts off the runway today, it doesn't rise as a weapon, it rises as a memory. A reminder of a world pushed to its limits, a world learning the brutal lessons of technology and war. And that brings us to the question that has followed the Zero since its first appearance. What should it be remembered as? To some, it is a marvel of engineering, a breakthrough design that shaped air combat for years. To others, it is a tragic symbol, a machine that promised much but was asked to do far more than it ever could. For many Japanese families, it represents loss. For many American pilots, it represents respect. The truth is that the Zero carries all these meanings at once. It is a contradiction, just like the nation that built it, the war that shaped it, and the pilots who flew it. It was both brilliant and flawed, both deadly and fragile, both triumphant and tragic. A fighter that dominated the early war and struggled in the later years. A masterpiece held back by an exhausted industrial base. A technological triumph overshadowed by a collapsing strategic vision. And perhaps that is why the Zero has remained so compelling. It is not just a machine. It is a mirror reflecting the tension between ambition and limitation, genius and reality, hope and defeat. In the end, the Zero story is not about an aircraft that soared too high, but about a world that changed faster than it could keep up. A world where dogfighting evolved into energy tactics, where maneuverability lost to horsepower, where art lost to industry. The Zero was perfect for the war Japan wanted to fight. It was not perfect for the war they actually fought. Yet even in its downfall, the Zero kept a dignity that few machines have ever carried. Because defeat does not erase brilliance, nor does it erase the courage of the men who flew it. And as historians look back, the Zero becomes something clearer, something more universal. A lesson, a warning, a symbol of the moment when technology pushed beyond reason and entered the realm of extremes. A reminder that no matter how graceful a machine may be, it must exist within a world defined by realities it cannot escape. And now, with the war long over, with the Zero preserved in museums and restored in hangars, a final question lingers. What exactly did the Zero leave behind? Not victory, not dominance, not the empire it was built to defend. What it left was understanding of air combat, of engineering limits, of the consequences of designing for perfection without considering sustainability. Its legacy is not measured in miles per hour, degrees per second, or turn radius. Its legacy is measured in wisdom. And that wisdom continues long after the engines fell silent. When people look at the Zero today, they no longer see a weapon. They see a story written in aluminum, in fuel lines, in engine cylinders, in the hands that built it, and in the lives that flew it. A story that stretches across oceans and decades, shaped by triumph, genius, loss, pride, and regret. But beneath all of that, the Zero leaves behind something deeper, something that reaches beyond engineering or tactics, something about humanity itself. The Zero teaches that the beauty of a machine does not guarantee its survival. Elegance does not guarantee victory. Perfection in one moment does not protect against the future. The Zero teaches that an aircraft, no matter how brilliant, cannot win a war alone. It needs fuel, it needs factories, it needs pilots who have flown enough hours to understand its limits. It needs a strategy that matches its strengths and protects its weaknesses. It needs a nation prepared to evolve as quickly as the enemy. The Zero teaches that early victories can be dangerous. They create illusions. They whisper promises that are easy to believe. They convince people that a single weapon can rewrite the rules of reality. But reality always pushes back. The Zero's early dominance created a myth that Japan's leaders believed too deeply, a myth that blinded them to the rising industrial tide across the ocean, a myth that hid the simple truth that no machine, no matter how agile, how elegant, or how feared, can outrun time. And time is what ultimately defeated the Zero. Time brought new American fighters. Time brought new training systems. Time brought pilots who learned from every mistake. Time brought factories that produced more engines in a month than Japan could build in half a year. Time brought strategy, organization, and teamwork. Time brought overwhelming momentum. The Zero could dodge bullets, but it could not dodge history. And yet, despite everything, the Zero remains unforgettable. Not because it won the war, but because it forced the world to evolve. Because it pushed aviation into a new era. Because it showed what was possible when engineers refused to accept limits. Because it changed the way pilots fought, the way nations planned, and the way aircraft were designed. You don't have to admire the politics behind it. You don't have to agree with the decisions that put it into battle. But you cannot deny the brilliance of its design or the courage of the men who flew it. The Zero was everything an aircraft could be when built with absolute faith in speed, precision, and maneuverability. And it was everything an aircraft cannot be when forced into a war defined by mass production, heavy armor, and overwhelming industrial strength. Its rise was breathtaking. Its fall was inevitable. Its legacy is eternal. When you see a restored Zero taxi across a runway today, its engine rumbling in a way only radial engines can, you feel something that goes beyond nostalgia or historical curiosity. You feel a connection to every pilot who ever flew one, to every engineer who ever riveted its thin aluminum skin, to every battle where it twisted through the air with impossible grace, to every moment where it struggled against a changing world it wasn't designed to survive. And when that Zero lifts off the ground, leaving its shadow behind on the pavement, it no longer belongs to Japan or America. It belongs to memory, to history, to all of us. Because the Zero's story is not just about war. It is about ambition, about the risk of believing too strongly in a single idea, about the courage of individuals caught inside systems larger than themselves, about the way technology reflects the dreams and flaws of the people who build it. The Zero soared because Japan dreamed boldly. It fell because Japan could not sustain that dream. And it is remembered because the world learned from both. In the end, the Zero stands as one of the clearest reminders in aviation history that brilliance without balance cannot endure. It shines brightly at the beginning, then burns out quickly. Beautiful, tragic, unforgettable. A machine that ruled the sky not because it was invincible, but because it dared to chase perfection. A machine that fell because the world moved faster than perfection could keep up. A machine that lives on because it changed everything, even after it could no longer change the outcome. And so, the next time you see a Zero, whether in a museum, in a documentary, or gliding through the air at an air show, remember this. It is not a symbol of victory or defeat. It is a symbol of possibility, of the heights a nation can reach when it pours its heart into innovation, and of the consequences when ambition outpaces reality. The Zero may have been overtaken by time, but time has never erased the mark it left behind.